Okay, I'm Steve Anderson. I was previously the chair of the linguistics department at Yale, which will turn out to be relevant. And it's my pleasure to introduce Gerald Shea. Jerry is not either a linguist or a psychologist, and so perhaps it's useful for me to give a little background. When I was chair in fact, almost exactly 8 years ago, I received in the mail a manuscript from someone I didn't know about a topic about which I didn't know very much. I'm sure Bob Frank, as current chair, will confirm the fact that we get lots of, the chair of linguistics at Yale gets lots of things, and some of them are a little unusual. But this one seemed to be worth a lot more attention, and not only because the author was a Yalie, BA 64. The manuscript I had, which was called Language of Light, it was called Song Without Words, was interesting for two somewhat different reasons. On the one hand, it described the experience of someone whose language experience is rather different from any of the ones that cognitive scientists tend to study. On the one hand, we study hearing people who learn spoken languages, and on the other hand, we study deaf people who learn signed languages. But here was the experience of someone who had lost a great deal of his hearing at a very early age, but that fact hadn't actually been properly diagnosed until much later in life. And he succeeded in the hearing community despite his hearing deficit, getting through Yale and getting through Columbia Law School. This, it seemed to me, was a situation that cognitive science ought to pay attention to. It's rather unusual to characterize the linguistic experience of someone functioning in a spoken language who has actually very limited access to speech as a consequence of the hearing deficit. So on the one hand, that struck me as an interesting problem for cognitive scientists. On the other hand, the book contained a great deal of really interesting information about the history of the emergence and development of signed language in France, which, as we know, is the background out of which ASL comes. Work that was based on Jerry's work in libraries and archives in France, and which taught me a great deal. I mean, I'd done some reading on this background, but I learned a lot from looking at this manuscript. So I was happy to encourage it and to recommend it for publication and to provide some comments, especially on the linguistic aspects. As I say, Jerry isn't a linguist, and there were some things that I thought needed a little bit of commentary. But then in 2013, the book was published as Song Without Words. The book is a lovely and eloquent book. If you haven't read it, you surely should. But when I saw what came out in print, I was somewhat less happy at the fact that all this stuff about the science of sign and the history had been omitted, and this was almost entirely about Jerry's experience as a partially hearing person. Well, I talked to him about this, and he said that was because the publishers wanted this to be a general audience book, and they said, take all that science and history stuff out of it. People will like it more if it's just a lovely experience. And it is a wonderful book, but I'm afraid that because that material was omitted, it's attracted less attention from linguists and cognitive scientists than perhaps it ought to have. But anyway, I was very happy a few years later when I heard from Jerry that he was interested in taking the material from his original manuscript that hadn't been included, expanding it and publishing that as a separate book. So I was happy to put him in touch with people at Yale University Press. The result is an absolutely wonderful book on the historical origins and development of signed language and the deaf community in France and subsequently in this country. If you haven't read Language of Light, then you should certainly read that one too. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Jerry, who will, I gather, be giving you material mostly from the second book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for coming. I think I'll take this device off. And thanks to Raphael Zanutini and her staff for organizing this conference so ably, and it's really a delight to be here, as it was to hear the two prior speakers. I learned a lot in the first hour and a half of today. As Steve explained, I first became familiar with the history and languages of the deaf when I was looking for information about the partially deaf from my first book, the memoir that Steve mentioned. As I discuss at length in that book, I am partially deaf, a condition that arose following an extended childhood illness. When others speak, I hear an elusive language to which, in the rapid course of conversation, I endeavor to give meaning. The words of this language, what I call its lyricals, a term of my invention, are transitional words, wrong words, non-words that, in lieu of those actually spoken, register in the minds of the partially deaf. The high frequency and soft consonants are usually missing. The vowels and the occasional consonant aren't enough. And my life and the lives of the partially deaf like me are a constant unscrambling of language punctuated by masks of understanding. I communicate fairly effectively using the hearing I've retained, lip reading, hearing aids, and an assortment of assistive listening devices. There's no time here to dwell on my history. It's all in Song Without Words if you want to buy it on Amazon. And it's all in there. When I finally did get hearing aids at age 34, a lot of sounds came back to me that were the sounds of childhood: crickets, birds, not seagulls, which I always heard, but, birds twerping in the air, piccolos, high-stringed instruments that brought the melody back to music for me rather than the counterpoint of low instruments. As to water is a beautiful sound, and when I was presenting the book at a gathering in London, the first book, Song Without Words, a reporter, Haley Campbell from the New Statesman, came up to me and said, "Hey, tell me something that I haven't, that's not, the critics don't talk about it, that nobody knows about it." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you a little bit about water. When I got hearing aids, the first day I got them, I went off to pee, and I had them on, and it was the first time I realized, since childhood, I guess, but I'd forgotten that when you pee, it actually makes a sound." So Haley Campbell in the New Statesman, she liked that, and in the New Statesman, these aren't my words, of course, they're hers, she said, "Imagine what it would be like going through life without knowing what piss sounded like." This room scares me to death. One more anecdote. I think I was in this room the very first lecture I was at Yale, and the teacher started to speak. I don't know, probably history, something easy. And when he started to speak, everybody picked up their pen and pencil. And, of course, I could hear his voice and a few words, but they were actually starting to write, and I thought, this must be a very good university, since the students are so bright. So my theme song might have been something like Gaudiamus Igitur, since we can't even hear the teachers. Moving on to the history now, I have no fluent understanding of the sign languages of the profoundly deaf, but the grace and visual clarity of those who communicated in sign languages, as you have just seen and as you are seeing now, are to me a wonder. And I feel a close affinity to it and to them. Theirs is not an unplanned, but a natural visual poetry at once both the speech and the music of the deaf. Though I live in the realm of the hearing, a part of my life, in the form of my search for communicative grace and clarity, is quartered in my understanding of the world of the deaf, and I feel as if a part of it. As I mentioned, I originally became familiar with the history and languages of the deaf when I was looking for information about people like me. I found that history so rich and intriguing and fraught with pathos that I decided to write about it. The Language of Light, my book, covers a long history from the classical period through our own day in about 200 pages. I can't talk about all of that in half an hour. Thus, I'd like to focus on what I consider the centerpiece of the history of the deaf and sign languages, i.e. the accomplishments of the great French teachers of the early 19th century, notably Auguste Bébion. This is also the heart of the book. I call this period the Enlightenment, or the Age of Bébion. But I'll also mention in unforgivably nutshell form the time before and the time after that era. The Age of Bébion, as we shall see, was an island of eloquence and wisdom in a wide, rapidly running river of ignorance and prejudice on the part of the hearing. A brief note first on what history and linguistics have taught us about sign languages, and we've heard much of that this morning. Children born profoundly deaf, of course, hear virtually nothing at all. They're unable to speak because their ears can't transmit to the brain the information it needs to shape the imitative speaking patterns of the voice. These children then turn instinctively to gestures in order to communicate with others. They do so extraordinarily and efficiently once they are exposed to a sign language, which they learn quickly and naturally. They are very soon able, exactly like their hearing counterparts, to express a limitless number of ideas in well-formed sentences with impeccable syntax. The discourse of the deaf is not, as in the case of spoken languages, configured by the tongue and other organs of speech, arranging molecules in the air for the ear, but by the motion of hands and other gestures that are transmitted by light to the eyes of their interlocutors, hence my title, The Language of Light. Sign languages are just as sophisticated as our spoken tongues. They have their own linguistic units, just as our oral languages do. When deaf individuals render or interpret signs, they use the same regions of the brain that the hearing do when they speak and listen to speech. They are hearing their language. There is little historical record of the deaf or of their languages before the 16th century, but sign languages in various forms and degrees of sophistication have probably existed for, at the very least, 100,000 years, for as long as mankind, and thus have deaf people. Sign languages were not invented by anyone, nor was French, English, or German. So the time before Bébion. Aristotle found the blind more intelligent than the deaf because the blind could hear. He believed that all rational discourse had to be audible. St. Augustine thought deaf people could never learn to read. The Justinian Code in 522 provided that if a person was deaf from birth and couldn't speak, he had virtually no rights. Diderot thought that to teach the deaf abstractions was an insurmountable task. Juan Pablo Monet, in the 17th century Spain, called the congenitally deaf monsters of nature and human only in form. His goal was to cure them by teaching them how to speak. He failed, of course, as did all of his Spanish, British, Dutch, French, German, and American oralist successors. It was virtually impossible for a person to speak distinctly if, since birth or early infancy, he or she had not been able to hear. Lip reading is just as difficult. While I and other partially deaf people lip read a bit, you have to be able to hear in order to do it well, or as well as we do, which is not very well. So forget about all those deaf characters reading lips for the CIA in those movies you see through hermetically sealed windows and a telescope. They're just reciting a script that they've memorized. I did, though, manage to do it once. I was watching, Bill Clinton was playing golf with Greg Norman, I think, who wore that straw hat. And there was a party afterwards somewhere in the States, and Clinton stepped backwards and fell over the porch and broke his leg. And they wheeled him out to Air Force One to set the leg in Washington. The leg was sticking out, and it was 2 kilometers out on the tarmac. But the cameras with their big lenses were there watching him, but no sound. And Clinton said, now the first 3 words are clear, right? What the F are the first 3 words. But what's the rest? What is... Now, no one in this room has an idea, but anybody, sometimes with context, you can get it. And what he said was, what the F are those photographers doing there? So I was very, very proud of myself, but it was, a once-in-a-lifetime event. So what did Monet think about sign language? He said, if you place 2 deaf mutes in each other's presence, meeting for the first time, they can communicate because they use the same signs, mirabile dictu. But he, like others, was not interested in trying to understand these signs or to ask himself what the deaf were saying to each other or where their signs came from or whether these communications might be a form of language. Indeed, because it interfered with their learning, the speech they weren't learning, he found it important, as alas many speech therapists and doctors do today, quote, never to let the mute use it, unquote. Torturous so-called medical treatments went hand in hand with the tyranny of oral teaching in the centuries before the Enlightenment. These amounted to trials by ordeal, yielding considerable suffering, illness, and sometimes death. The premise was that drilling, cutting, fracturing, scorching, or poisoning would open up the ear and the brain to sounds. It was into this oral world that arrived the Abbé de l'Épée, a hearing priest about to make history. Observing deaf twin girls signing to each other in 1755, he suspected that their signs were mutually recognizable representations of ideas. Going a step further, he wondered whether, just as hearing children are taught to write what they hear, so these children might be taught to write what they see, i.e., to be taught in their own signs the meaning of written words and to learn how to read and write those words. L'Épée established his school for the deaf in Paris in 1755, and the royal government ultimately granted him a substantial annual stipend to run it. But for all his perceptiveness, it was the first time anybody had done this, L'Épée didn't become fluent in signs and never understood it was a complete language. He gave his students his own supplementary signs rather than learning from them and mastering their own integral tongue. He died in 1789, but in 1794 the government gave his school its imposing home on the Rue Saint-Jacques, where it is today, the National Institute for Deaf Children, called Saint-Jacques. It was to become, and today remains, the beacon of the age of the Enlightenment. Auguste Babillon, who was hearing, and perhaps history's greatest teacher of the deaf, was born the year L'Épée died. He was sent by his father from Guadeloupe, where he was born, to study at the Lycée Charlemagne in Paris. His parents were friends of the director of Saint-Jacques, who offered to find a place for him to live. Babillon lived near the school, and in the afternoons and during the vacations, he was constantly there, joining the deaf students in their classes, workshops, and games. Although hearing, he made friends with several of the deaf students, and thanks to Jean Massieu, a noted deaf teacher there, learned to sign as well as those who were deaf from birth, an unprecedented accomplishment. Babillon's writings and teachings were to become the cornerstone of the education of the deaf in Europe and of the deaf in the United States. What was needed, he realized, in order to teach his students to read and write was the immediate translation of their own thoughts and images as expressed in their own language into the corresponding written words in French. Central to his thought and teaching is the reality that words are but the expression of pre-existing ideas. An idea whether the conception of a material object or an abstract thought necessarily precedes the spoken word interpreting it. It is thus the idea, he wrote, that must give the word meaning before the word can, in turn, become an effective interpreter of the idea, or what John Locke had interestingly called the sign of the idea. The hearing ordinarily convey their thoughts by speaking, or by writing down words made of letters that are depictions of the sound we make with our voices, what Bébion eloquently called the painting of our speech. While students arriving at Saint-Jacques would have at least the rudiments of sign, Bébion, in his practical teaching manual, hypothesized the case of a new student at Saint-Jacques in order to illustrate for parents and teachers that even the teaching of individual words should begin with the thought, not the written word. The teacher might show the picture of a saber in a book and then move his dominant hand from opposite waist to shoulder height as if drawing a saber from a sheath, exaggerating the sign. Remember, they're not recognizably iconic. And the student would invariably do the same. Bébion would unsheath the imaginary saber again and have the student show him its picture in the book, whereupon he would point to the written word beneath the picture. He would then have the student fingerspell the word, if he knew fingerspelling, and ask him in sign what the word meant. What? The student would then repeat the gesture and before long would understand that this written word and others were a kind of conventional drawing of the idea first expressed in sign. As to ideas expressed in whole sentences, Bébion knew that the aberrant goal before his time, and continuing to his own day, was to give to the deaf, and I quote, the mechanical faculty of speech without enabling them to attach a precise idea to its components, leaving them in the dark, not only as to the absolute value of words, but their relative value and the influence they have over each other in the composition of a phrase. Hence the drill even today of parents and speech therapists hammering home the pronunciation and lip reading of multiple words by deaf children have of necessity got things backwards, for without sign language, it is difficult, if not impossible, to convey ideas and syntax and whole meanings of sentences. Bébion thus correctly emphasized that French grammar, which he described as the relationship between words in our spoken languages, had to be taught through the medium of sign language. He said, the deaf student must be able to write the word in order to read it. And to be able to read it, he has to understand it. And he'll be able to understand it only if he understands the whole sentence. To do that, his instruction must begin in sign. Writing for the deaf prima facie represented nothing at all. It consists of lines or strokes forming meaningless characters, more complex than their painting of sounds for the hearing, and far more removed from the underlying idea than its expression in their native language. And in trying to read lips, the deaf are not receiving any idea, but are forced to observe obscure lip movements in order to guess sounds they cannot hear, so that they may infer the other sounds that the lips fail to show at all. The mental torture of Monet and his Oralist successors. If the deaf student, Bébion wrote, is brought to a standstill to begin with by the singular difficulty of pronouncing sounds of which the signs fixed on paper lie stationary before his eyes, how is he going to understand the rapid signs that slip through the lips? It is with their own language that the education of the deaf must begin, not with the spoken word. We know, Bébion wrote, that the deaf have a language one doesn't teach them, although with art and exercise one can offer it the happiest development. It is, in a way, the reflection of their sensations, the relief of their impressions. We carry the same timeless and limitless principle within all of us, that of the first language of any human being, which gives immediate expression to his thought and is not a translation of any other language, but expresses his intimate connection with ideas. One never looks to his first language with difficulty for the expression of an idea. The thought, born in the brain, bursts forth like a flame sparkling in crystal. How effective was Babillon? In 1789, at the time of Lépé's death, there were 6 schools for the deaf in France. By 1858, there were 54 such schools, and sign was the language of instruction in all of them. A significant number of teachers of the deaf were deaf themselves. Deaf education and literacy were springing up everywhere, with deaf children in Europe reading Racine, Cervantes, Goethe, and Pushkin, as well as Augustine's spiritual dimensions, proclaiming that the deaf would never be able to read the very book they were reading or any other. On the more practical side, the potential of the deaf in the arts and sciences and in commerce were now realizable, and signed languages were becoming the motor of their equality. Together, Babillon and his deaf colleagues and students were changing the world. Students were entering the professions of the hearing, including work in lawyers' offices, banks, trading companies, etc. Some were accomplished painters and poets. It wasn't a perfect world, but now they had 2 languages, French Sign Language and the written and European Sign Language, languages, and the written language of the hearing. They were succeeding in the hearing world. And what happened in America? Well, we were, of course, seeking solutions too, and in 1816, as most of us here know, Thomas Gallaudet of Hartford came to France looking for a solution, leaving London after the British wanted to charge him for teaching him their ineffective oral methods, which they maintained were secret. He went to Saint-Jacques and took back to the States with him a prominent deaf teacher named Laurent Clerc. Clerc and Gallaudet brought Babillon's teaching with them to the United States, with which they formed the Deaf Corps of American Teachers. English immigrants had given us our spoken and written language, but the French, in the person of Laurent Clerc, enriched American Sign Language with French Sign and used the new combined language, ASL, to teach the American deaf the written language of France's rival across the Channel. By the 1850s, some 250 of the 550 teachers and administrators in the burgeoning national network of schools were themselves deaf. By the 1860s, there were 26 schools, and sign was the language of instruction of all. But for a variety of reasons, the champions of speech teaching would never let go. Babillon's deaf pupil, Ferdinand Berthier, the greatest deaf teacher of the deaf and deaf leader of the 19th century, was well aware of it. He did a lot to try to stop it. One of the most beautiful things he did, I think, was to organize annual deaf banquets that were held all around Paris between 1832 and 1869 or so. And he invited the greats to come, Daguerre, Victor Hugo, Lamartine, and many others. And like today, he had children of deaf parents who were hearing do the interpreting so that everybody could understand everybody else, just as we are doing today. Berthier was also a poet, and I'll quote this poem because I love it. It's much better than my English translation, but here it goes. As background, the Phoenician alphabet, about 1000 BC, is the source of virtually all modern alphabets. Berthier himself referred to this point in his own poem, pronouncing in sign language and interpreted by another at one of these banquets. Here it is. We do not speak, it is true, but still, do you think us unable to express ourselves as well with our eyes, our hands, our smiles, our lips? Our most beautiful discourse is at the tips of our fingers, and our language is rich in secret beauties that you who speak will never know. And have we not our own art of Phoenicia to paint the words that speak into our eyes? Your arts and sciences, save for sound, are they not open to our ardent minds? Show us the heavens, ambitious heirs of Icarus, that I cannot ascend with you. But as I say, Berthier was well aware of the forces against him. He warned his colleagues and students alike that if they didn't fight for their education in their own language, they would lose everything. After Babillon, the 19th century oralist movement deliberately set out to destroy the languages and educational institutions of the deaf. In effect, the movement all but ruined the extraordinary accomplishments of the great European and American teachers of the earlier part of the century. The oralists were led by Alexander Graham Bell and by hearing teachers of the deaf and others in Europe and the United States. At the 1880 Congress of Milan, as many of us here know, a gathering of hearing educators went with little knowledge of sign languages. The assembly proudly proclaimed the incontestable superiority of speech over sign and resolved that deaf students should be taught only by the pure oral method. Before long, throughout Europe, speech became virtually the sole method of teaching by requiring deaf students to hear or lip read and to speak impossible tasks, virtually impossible tasks. Milan made the sole faculty these students lacked the instrument of their instruction. What was the motive of the oralists? Why insist on teaching a child words he couldn't speak and staring at lips he couldn't understand? For some, notably the oral teachers, the motive was the desire to keep their jobs. As to Bell, he conceded that sign language was the quickest method of reaching the mind of a deaf child. But it was not the mind of the deaf child that interested Bell. Quote, "The production of a defective race of signing human beings," he wrote, "would be a great calamity to the world. If they were deprived of their language of signs, the deaf would be unable to understand not only the hearing, but each other. They would marry less, have fewer children, and their number would diminish." Even Bell's prejudiced ideas about eugenics were without foundation, for, as mentioned earlier, about 95% of children born deaf, then and today, are born of hearing parents. Bell and his allies were extraordinarily successful. In 1867, American Sign Language had been the medium of instruction in all educational institutions for the deaf. By 1927, it was used in virtually none. Deaf students were graduating from oralist schools in Europe and America as functional illiterates in the written languages of their native countries. Gallaudet College was discouraging its students from becoming teachers. In France, the country of Babillon, as recently as 2015, a prominent ear surgeon wrote in Le Figaro that, quote, "Speech is the only language the brain can comprehend," unquote. Finally, some brighter signs. The eminent linguist Noam Chomsky, giving a lecture in Chicago in 1965, mistakenly, that's a Chomsky mistake, defined language as a specific sound-to-meaning correspondence. When asked where this left the signed languages of the deaf, Chomsky revised his definition on the spot, calling language a specific signal-to-meaning correspondence. The distinction was important, for it was offered at a time when William Stokey and his colleagues at Gallaudet University were rediscovering what had been known in France and America in the early 19th century. Much of what Stokey wrote about linguistics was really taken from Babillon's own writings. Stokey gave him credit. It wasn't very conspicuous credit, but he did give Babillon credit. So these ideas that are coming up today, they're not new ideas. These were ideas that were developed in the early 19th century and were suppressed with the money of Bell in the United States, with the Pereiras in Europe, with the help of the oralist teachers and the oralist movement. And they basically smothered what we knew. So much so that when people rediscovered it in the 20th century, they thought they were discovering something new, and they weren't. Chomsky's work and the work of Stokoe and his successors were of exceptional significance. This was so not simply because the hearing world had forgotten what it had known by the 1820s, but because of the calamitous success, as I just said, or I'm repeating myself, of the Oralist movement. Have the thoughts and work of Chomsky, Stokoe, and others now helped to overcome the educational plight of the deaf? They've unquestionably led to a renaissance of linguistic and educational interest in sign languages, giving new life, including now our academic life here at Yale, to the seminal work of Babillon. It is now broadly understood that Chomsky's language faculty operates with equal facility, whether stimulated by language heard by the ears of the hearing or beheld by the eyes of the deaf. The primitive notions of the deaf and their language, espoused at Milan and promoted by Bell, are now rather thoroughly discredited. But the educational problems of the deaf persist today. 80% of newborn deaf babies in the West are being given cochlear implants. The implants are devices, as most of us know, that produce hearing, bypassing the ear and delivering electronic signals directly to the auditory nerve. The benefits of cochlear implants are measured today in a laboratory setting and, alas, appear to fall far short outside of that setting. Thus, the real world of daily communication is still a struggle despite the device, notably for children who were born deaf. Language can be said to give us, all of us, whether deaf or hearing, our modern soul in the age of science, and to underpin our rights as individuals. Whether that soul can best be expressed and understood and can best understand the world around it in its natural language or with cochlear implants, or perhaps both, is the heart and soul of the matter. Is a smaller, fully communicative world preferable to a larger, poorly communicative one? Is there a both worlds alternative? Are the implants a paradigmatic change, or are they an extension of the dramatic course of 19th and 20th century deaf history and of earlier times? There are a variety of views on these hotly debated questions. My own views are shaped both by my own research, by a careful study of published test results, and naturally enough, by my intimate acquaintance with the history. I propose no answers here, but whatever the answers, it is critically important that we assure that these children, born deaf, be given the opportunity to learn as soon as possible in life what is their own, their first, their natural language, and evocation of the soul itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We now have some time for questions. I suggest that we turn your question period into the question period for
Sure, let's do that. Yeah.
right, for everyone. So
Sit down. Yep.
please feel free to ask questions for our last speaker, but also for the other two panelists. Okay? We have two microphones that will run up and down the aisles to receive your questions. Okay? Siri, we have a question here.
Hi, thank you all for speaking today. It was a great event. Anyone can answer this, but it's a question regarding language acquisition.
Be a little louder.
Oh, it's a question regarding language acquisition. I was wondering, like we're talking about in class, most, if not all, users of sign are bilingual. They have their language of sign and also their written language, because sign language doesn't have a written form. So how are the acquisition processes for these different? Can you guys speak to your personal experiences with this? Or because there is an understanding of an inborn filter for language, but does it work differently for sign versus writing?
So I think the question is the acquisition process in
Different.
sign language
Yeah.
different from the language acquisition process in spoken languages?
No, for when you're learning how to write the written language, because there's like written English language versus the sign language. So most users of sign are bilingual in that sense. So is a language acquisition process for that different? And how does that work?
I can speak a little bit to that. I don't specialize in literacy of deaf children, but I do know a little bit about the research that exists. There are studies, a great deal of studies looking at that. There are, we know, deaf students who are very successful in terms of literacy skills. The question is, how do they become such good readers? And how do they become literate in a written language that does not apply to their sign language abilities? It's entirely separate. Because the written language does not track with the sign language that they use. Let me just back up for just a minute. For hearing children, learning a spoken language tracks with the written language that they also learn. And there's much research that shows phonological knowledge of the language really boosts the ability to learn to read and write. So a lot of language literacy instruction has to do with phonology and how that plays into learning to read and write. So that phonology does not map, of the written language does not map onto a sign language used by deaf students. Research today is looking at how deaf students may capitalize on the phonology of their sign language to assist in the process or support the process of learning to read and write. Not all of the literacy applies to deaf children in this area, but there are some findings that we can apply to the situation in deaf education. So there's some evidence that the morphology of sign languages having phonology, a foundation in one language, can be used to enhance the language learning process in literacy of a second language.
I'd like to add one thing to what Amber said. So every child, regardless if they're learning a spoken language or a sign language, has to be taught how to read and write. The writing systems aren't universal. They're a cultural invention. So it's always the case that the process of learning how to read and write is different from language acquisition. So the question is, how is it different for sign language and visual language users versus spoken language users? Because there's not a one-to-one mapping in phonological form. And that's the research question that we have not yet, well, that we're still looking at now. It's a current area of research.
As to syntax, Babiel made the wonderful point in teaching kids that he would first go through the notion of a sentence. This table I strike. I think in those days, I don't know whether it's the case now, but the sentence would often begin with the object. So a signing student would be signed by Babiel, this table I strike. He'd make sure the student got the idea, and then having been through the exercise of teaching the child words and sentences, he would say, well, when you write it down, you don't write this table I strike, you write I strike this table. This is the way these crazy hearing people do it. And so he was quite good, I think, at getting syntax and grammar through to those kids.
There is a question next to you.
A friend of mine online was upset with the Kochler marketing where children were not supposed to be taught sign. She herself was deaf, and she was very offended with this, and I can certainly understand her attitude towards genocide. But
Towards, what did you say?
genocide, that's where you exterminate an entire culture. That's what the Kochler people early on were trying to do. It's a natural, very typical, natural, asinine sort of thing people do. They wanted to help people. So, of course, they had to exterminate other efforts to help. But looking into this, it looks to me as though baby sign is very beneficial to the intellectual and spiritual development of small children at a very important age of development. A child who can express himself at the age of 1 is going to be developing rhetorical abilities an entire year before most children can make noises come out of their faces. But now, this evening, I understand baby sign could be significant towards the training of future engineers because of the spatial aspect. And I say that very seriously. A moment ago, we were talking about the inadequacies of written language, to which I would respond that there is also a subject of drafting, which could expand written language, could be seen as expanding written language in the direction of spatial orientation. So it seems to me that baby sign is a very important subject, and sign language should not be confined to special education or linguistic rarities, but should be learned by every parent. Beyond that, I would like to know, how do I say Nicaragua? It seems to be very important this evening, Nicaragua.
How do you say what?
Nicaragua.
Oh, Nicaragua. Thank you. Thank you for, yeah. I guess there's a simple question, how do we say Nicaragua? And a longer question about the importance of signs.
If you're asking a specific question about baby sign, I can't answer that without first saying that we can't talk about baby signs for hearing children, unless we also are talking about education, teaching sign language to deaf children. So I would say issues about teaching hearing infants to sign, okay, that's an individual decision for parents to make. But we can't talk about that first. I think first we need to address the fact that deaf children need to have equal opportunities. That's where the focus needs to be first. This is the sign for Nicaragua. Nicaragua in NSL.
I have a question for, particularly for Dr. Martin and colleagues about the relationship between the origins of language and spatial works. So one of the interesting things in the archaeological record is that with the stone tool traditions, we see stone tools from a couple of million years ago, and they're unchanged, and then we get bifacial blades, they're called. So we get symmetrical stone flakes, and then they change, they stay unchanged, and so on for another 500,000 years, and then we see a stone tool specialization, we see different shapes of tools and so on. So, of course, the production of the bifacial blades, the ones with the chips on either side, requires being able to manipulate tools and think about symmetry at the same time. So I'm wondering if you see that as a potential clue to language development, or whether it's something like the later proliferation of stone tools and the variation and so on, which might be more indicative. Or just any thoughts you have on this matter would be great.
Honestly, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. You're talking about comparing the development of those two things. Over time, in the emergence of a language, and how spatial ideas like symmetry and things like that, how they influence and shape language. Is that what you're addressing?
It's more the question related to Dr. Kokab's point about about tracing language origins and I guess cultural evolution and biological evolution of language. So we see these, I guess, evidence. We see pieces of evidence for cultural development over millions of years, but yet the work on Nicaraguan Sign Language suggests that language development for these kids is very quick within 2 generations or three generations. So I'm wondering what lessons we can learn about reading back contemporary situations back into the remote past. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it too.
A difficult question, yeah.
I have some thoughts. I'm not sure, though, if my thoughts will actually answer your question. But would you like to take a shot at that, Anne-Marie? Something that comes to mind for me is, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, part of what Dr. Kokab talked about in terms of cognitive tools and resources that we have, those may have appeared long, long ago. And those might be things that we can take advantage of to create language. So the languages that we create must, those cognitive resources must be in place for that to occur. So the emergence of spatial language and how it emerges. For example, we see that for people learning sign language, well, for all people, hearing or deaf, there are strengths and weaknesses in terms of mental rotation capabilities. What some of us are good at, strengths that we bring to the table, come into play when we think about human beings. For those who talk about other things, have other strengths and weaknesses, there may be something about the language itself that uses certain skills to incorporate in the development of the language in the first place. So the kind of thing that you might be talking about is where long, long ago, historically, perhaps a cognitive ability emerged at some point in the history of human development, and then there comes a time where language is needed to capitalize on something, to be able to do something. And then that feeds back into the development of the language as a cycle. That's the type of thing I'm thinking about. I'm not sure if it addresses what you're interested in knowing about, but those are my thoughts.
I'm also not completely sure what the question was. Was it, well, so you said that tools started out as one thing, and then at some point, there was a point where they became widespread and specialized. And you're asking if that parallels what we're seeing in language emergence. Was that the question you were asking? Or are you talking about Chomsky's proposal for single mutation changes that allows for our language faculty?
Yeah, so I guess the question, I guess not exactly, I guess is the answer to that. So we have in the biological versus the cultural ideas about evolution of language, this gradualist idea that we build up cultural scaffolding from communication systems which are non-linguistic like or proto-linguistic like or something like that. But we also have this biological capacity for language which is which is presumably relatively abrupt. If it's a single gene mutation, it's the time it takes for that to percolate through a population, which is, well, could be
I'm sorry, the
anything.
interpreters are actually having trouble hearing you.
Your mic keeps dropping out, it seems, and so they're having difficulty understanding the question that you're asking and then can't interpret it correctly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. Is that better if I hold it a bit closer? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, maybe my accent. I have an Australian accent, so and also a cold. And it's a complicated topic as well. So I guess we have this biological abruptness versus cultural gradualism. And some interplay of the two, and I think Dr. Kokab, you have made that very clear in your talk to start the afternoon. But we also have this work in the cultural evolution literature and the cognitive evolution literature on these spatial manipulation. Evolution of spatial manipulation, evolution of stone tools, and the combination of the learning of how to make stone tools and the cognitive capacity for just doing the manipulation to make the chips that we need to make in the first place. So just doing the manipulation of the stone to make the tools. And it was just striking to me that your two talks together brought up many of these points that come to debates in this literature. So so I was interested in discussing that further. But I agree, it's a very complex topic, and if we had answers here, we could all go home.
I think we have time for one more question.
Mr. Shea, in your striking book,
There's a
The
question
Language
over
of Light,
here.
one of the more striking aspects of the story of deaf education, to me anyway, was the role of Helen Keller in that story. You want to tell that a little bit about that?
The answer would be a long one. I'll try to make it short. Helen Keller was remarkable. She was deaf and blind from the age of about 7, and she got all the way through Radcliffe. But there is disappointing evidence in the history that at a young age, a work that was presented as her own was in fact plagiarized by Anne Sullivan from a book. And it was a great crisis in Helen's life. The head of the Perkins School in Boston disowned her, in effect. And she ultimately recovered from that. Many people jumped to her defense. She was only a child, of course, but there is some thought that much of her writing in later life may have been written in large part by others. Whether it was or not, she was brilliant. She did get through Radcliffe and accomplished a lot. But one of the problems I think Helen always had, she never learned how to speak audibly. She never learned how to read lips, read lips by touch. But Alexander Graham Bell used her as a kind of advertisement for oralist teaching, and his favorite phrase was, well, if blind and deaf Helen Keller can speak and read lips, well, why can't, and learn so much, why can't the deaf who are not blind accomplish that? But lots of what he said about Helen was false. It also turns out in history that when Helen was very young, she had a well-developed system of home signs, which could have been, with the proper teachers, with somebody like Bébion and his successors, turned her into an even more remarkable woman, a genius, than she was without the ability to practice her own native language. Those who are interested, there's a full chapter on Helen in The Language of Light, and you all may find it interesting. Thank you.
Okay, sure, there's one more question there.
Hi, thank you. I have a question. A lot of hearing people, especially hearing parents now, are finding, the advantages of using sign language with infants right away after birth, because it's, the brain is just going right from the beginning a child is born, and they're seeing the importance of making connection to the things that are in the world. and it's just so helpful for a child, just on the ratio of knowledge. My question is, I've seen children here that never had a basic language, like, for instance, a child that might be in school who really doesn't know sign language, who's deaf, doesn't really understand English, even though they're trying to teach that child English because at home the family's speaking Spanish. So it seems like if you're missing your fundamental language, foundational language, you're really at a disadvantage. And also with us, with hearing parents, we're always talking to our child. So right away, it's putting on the jacket, the booties. This is milk. This is, we're constantly making a connection to things for them to be able to, gain knowledge of their environment. And I was just curious, when you were in Nicaragua, did you find any deaf parents with deaf children, or did you find families that had many deaf members to be able to see how they communicated, if that communication was so much better because the children were getting right away connection to the environment rather than 3 years of delayed no language, no fundamental language until they got into school? Did you find any families like that, or is that something you'd be interested in? Thank you.
There are a few individuals who have deaf relatives, deaf aunts, and so forth. And yes, their language tends to be on a par with what we would see in a typically developing situation. And you absolutely have a rich environment. Having a rich environment has a positive impact on their language development. One thing I want to make sure that I emphasize, so often hearing parents who have a deaf child they're afraid, how will I learn sign language well enough? I can't possibly do that. That's not my language. And that fear sometimes drives them, and there are a multitude of other reasons as well, but it could drive them to using spoken English. And I didn't highlight this in my talk, but a lot of what we know is that children are prodigious language learners, and they often will surpass their input. So really, the message that we want to send to parents is that anything helps. Learning sign with your kid helps their language development. That's been shown. So don't underestimate what the kid has and what they can do.
Right. And deaf families in Nicaragua are quite rare. I actually don't know of anyone who's taken a look at counting that. We know of a few, but there aren't many. I feel like there's more here in the United States, but I could be wrong. I don't think there's ever been a count done. But in Nicaragua, I certainly don't know of many, but a couple, yes.
Okay, last question.
I already spoke, so I'm happy to give up the mic to someone who hasn't.
Why don't you speak so the interpreters can hear you?
Okay, I'll just talk. So I have a couple questions. My first one being, as two highly successful deaf women, how do you go about facing prejudice in the workplace? I mean, that's just really fascinating to me. I'm a CODA, and so I kind of have experience seeing that prejudice. I'm just wondering, I mean, I'm so happy that you guys are here, and I don't know, I'm just interested in that. How do you have advice about counteracting that prejudice and things like that?
Wow.
Sorry, that's so much.
Wow.
I'm sorry, that's...
Yes, it's okay in many different ways, all the time.
I'm
Henry?
so sorry.
Maybe it would be helpful if you are curious about if we're currently facing that prejudice as adults or when we were younger, because my answer would be different in those two contexts.
You guys are both working at high-ranking institutions. Do you feel like you still experience that? Okay. Sorry, that's a bad question.
It's fine.
Okay. Yes, I can say a couple of things. Yes, I do experience things like that. Also, I have created a space for myself at my current place of employment where I make it work for me. I make it that way intentionally for myself. And also, I have support from colleagues in my workplace. So to be honest, I think I have a pretty good place of employment where my colleagues are supportive of me and my work, and they listen to what I have to say about what I need. And they basically allow me to design the system there that I want, that works for me. And I think it's partly because, well, quite honestly, I don't know why that is, but I do feel that there are just good people there.
I'll briefly add one thing. This goes back to the intro of this panel. I'm lucky that I'm in the field that I'm in, that appreciates the importance of sign language, not only socially, but on an intellectual and academic level. I'm also lucky because my institution has a lot of resources to support me in that work. But in that environment, being in an environment where people really are appreciative of the study of sign language, like you all are, that helps a lot. And that's fine. And that's why I really thank you all for hosting this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.